I've been thinking about this. I think the thing is, I think I learned too early in my life that when I say something and people get angry, I just like how that feels. I don't know why, but I learned it too early. I think that's the problem.
Oh boy. Should I start? Okay. Hi everybody. I hope you're not going too crazy during quarantine right now. I wish that I had a fun and simple video for you, but I really don't. What I have today for you might be a bit of a mess, but we have to talk about the new Louis special because this is a huge moment in the history of stand-up, and no one really seems to be talking about it.
How are you? How was your last couple of years? How?
And this should go without saying, I'm not an expert in, sexual misconduct or any of these things. That's not my field. I'm here to talk about stand-up. So if you want a diagnosis or like a discussion into the weeds of what he did and those women, that's not what this is. We're here to talk about the stand-up. And that's not to say that that's not valid, but there you go. Yeah? Okay. Let's try and do this. Let's take a step back and look at what he has done thus far for stand-up and why we should even care. Because if any other comedian dropped an $8 special on their own website, probably wouldn't be talking about it. But it's Louis, so here we are. And if you just want to jump to me talking about the new special because you're just overly curious, that's totally valid. I'll put the timestamp right here. Okay. Cool. So when we look at Louis C.K.'s contributions to stand-up comedy, I really see it in three main arenas. But before we get into those three arenas, I just have to remind you guys how huge he really was. Because it can be hard to remember how big Louis C.K. was. And a part of the reason it's hard to remember how big he was is because it's hard to remember what exactly was appealing about him. But we need to take a step back, look at the world, 15 to 10 years ago in America, and remember that there was a time when we were craving a comedian who would tell us what they were actually feeling and tell us some like dark, twisted, angry thoughts that needed to be exercised. A big part of Louis is catharsis, and I don't really think that is in as much demand today. Right now, it seems like everyone is talking about terrible things all the time, and it feels like the whole world is on fire. It can be hard to remember when that was, but that was a big appeal of what Louis was. He was a truth teller. He was able to synthesize complicated, messy, emotional, philosophical ideas and make them palatable. So that is all that I'm talking about when I talk about how he changed stand-up. In the first arena, just is on stage. I remember I had a professor in college who really loved Louis C.K. And part of the reason that he loved him was that he also had two little kids. And it was just really, really refreshing for him to someone talk about how their kids can be assholes and how being a parent is really hard. That was something that just wasn't kind of talked about as much. It's good that there's room for a more nuanced take. And if we're talking about anything today, we're trying to talk about nuance. The second main arena that I want to talk about when we talk about how Louis changed stand-up comedy is in terms of writing. Now, you might not think about how comedians write their stand-up because it's not the sexiest, it's not like the most visual part of being a comedian, but it is probably one of the most important parts. Yes, sometimes some comedians write from the stage. That's not any less valid than comedians sitting with a, marble composition book in a cafe or whatever. A moleskin probably is what I'm picturing. But the writing is a huge part of it. And Louis C.K. did two very specific things when it came to writing stand-up that, every comedian seemed to be aping when Louis was huge. So the first of those things that Louis did in terms of writing as a stand-up comedian is that Louis was famous for writing an hour a year. And he did that pretty consistently from about 2005 to 2017 until, we'll get to. But writing an hour a year is something that once they saw Louis being able to do it, they realized they were able to do. It's kind of like first guy to run a mile under 4 minutes, and then everyone started doing it. Like, oh my gosh, wait, if Louis can write an hour a year, maybe I can write an hour a year too. I remember comedians saying, oh, it's only 5 minutes a month. Like, that's easy. And a lot of comedians produced a lot of trash during this time because they were telling jokes that weren't ready yet. But it also put this engine under comedians that I really loved to see. And then the other part of that, the second thing that Louis did as a writer, is a part of what made it possible for him to write a new special every year, and that's putting your best joke first. Traditionally, in stand-up, it's kind of a famous famous cliche thing that you start with your second best joke, get the audience glued in, and then that way you can end with your best joke, big closer, standing ovation, everyone loves you, ta-da, the end, they go home happy. But Louis C.K. turned that on its head, and he said, no, I'm going to start with my best joke. And doing that is a little masochistic, but it forces you to find something to close with. You kind of, if you haven't planned well, you're grasping at straws. If you have, you sort of have an idea of a joke that could be good enough to close with. But it creates this sort of cycling through of your material where if you have a joke that's mediocre, but you realize you have to close with it, you're going to work harder to make it good. So this way you can work through your jokes, make them as good as possible. When they're the best, then they go back to the front and a new joke has to go to the end. See what I'm saying? And then when that joke is really good, it gets cycled to the front. And hopefully after, a year of doing this, you have a full hour of good shit. That's the goal. That's the theory, right? That's the Louis C.K. school of writing stand-up, I guess. And then the third of which is distribution. So what people were saying, how they were writing it, and then how they were putting it out. Louis C.K. came at the right time for this, but he also was one of the first comedians to just get rid of the middleman, get rid of the gatekeepers in so many ways, especially when it comes to his TV show. He reinvented the sitcom, made it work for a modern audience, but he was able to do that basically all himself. But he's just been distributing his own stuff on his site. He doesn't care about a middleman, and he's big enough that he doesn't need one. No one, Comedy Central, Netflix, no one is getting a penny from that $8 that you're paying to watch his special, but him and his team, that's it. That's pretty badass. I remember in 2012, Patton Oswalt gave this great keynote at the Just for Laughs Festival where he talked about how there was sort of a pre-According to Jim world and a post-Louis world, and how the rules of those worlds were really different. And Louis C.K. came at a time where he was able to teach comedians some self-reliance, right? Taught comedians, hey, if I want something, if I want a podcast, if I want a web series, if I want, super funny things online or super funny elements of my shows, I can just go out and do it. And that is possible now, and that might not have been possible 20 years ago. But we're living in a space where comedians can just make shit. And thanks to things, like Patreon, they can get direct support from them. Or, if you're big enough, you can just be Louis, not even have a Patreon, and just be paid directly for the work that you put out. And when you're putting your own stuff up there, when you don't have a gatekeeper, you can put up whatever you want. It's thanks to Louis that we have Tig Notaro's Live, which is one of the best comedy specials of the decade. He also, supported Barry Crimmins. Barry Crimmins' special is on his site. And he's been supporting comedy clubs since the quarantine. I remember he gave a few $1,000s to a comedy club in Boston, just casually. And I don't know that because he was loud about it on social media. I know that because I'm friends with someone that owns a comedy club and they told me, right? This is real. This is what's happening. And, shout out to anyone who's giving money and not announcing it, right? So all of that sounds really great, doesn't it? He's this really cool comedian. He's making comedians think differently about what they're doing, and he's bringing comedy into a new decade. Whenever a comedian reaches that point, they become the trendsetter, just like in other art forms. And stand-up history kind of goes in these waves, and we definitely had a Louis crest that changed what stand-up was. I wouldn't say that his career was at its peak when the cancellation happened, but spoiler alert, he got canceled pretty dang hard in 2017. This story came out in the New York Times about a bunch of women telling stories about sexual misconduct, I'll call it, on his part. And I don't think that that's a controversial statement from me. He wrote pretty explicitly about it and about the things that he did. So I don't think I'm being edgy by saying that at all. But who knows? I said this then, and I'll say it again now. I think it's one of the best statements that came out during the Me Too movement. But I'll also say that that isn't exactly a high bar, right? That's not the highest bar in the world. Most of those were pretty terrible. You can read it yourself. I suggest you do so. But there are a lot of lines that point to a man being confronted with some of his own demons, or at least, he's doing his best to create a space where he can get uncanceled at some point. And that's your judgment if you believe him or not. But listen to this. The power I had over these women is that they admired me, and I wielded that power irresponsibly. I've been remorseful of my actions. I can hardly wrap my head around the scope of hurt I brought upon them. And then at the end he says, I have spent my long and lucky career talking and saying anything I want. I will now step back and take a long time to listen. And that's what he did. That's what he did for, a couple months, for a while. It was less than a year before he was back on stage, and you can define for yourself what the word long means, I guess. Okay, so we're back to our little story here. Louis C.K. has decided to step away. A lot of people are really upset with him. A lot of people are angrily not upset with him. But the nation's kind of divided. Things are tense. It's Me Too. He takes a step back. And then, he starts creeping back in a little bit. He starts to dip his toe in the water. He starts doing drop-ins at the Cellar and at other comedy clubs. And the Cellar starts putting this thing in their emails that I remember getting all the time because I love that club. But they would start putting this thing in their emails that said, swim at your own risk sort of thing. And they have a little icon of a swimmer. And the whole idea is, hey, some comedians might come here tonight that you do not want to see. And here's the policy for if you feel that way. They kind of comp to your stuff, which was pretty cool, I guess. But that was the Cellar clearly making a statement of, hey, we want Louis here. And we don't care if you don't want Louis here, which is a bold statement to make in the middle of Me Too. I know that a lot of people were upset by that. So he starts doing those shows. He does some drop-ins here and there. Some of the sound bites get leaked, and that causes such a stir because it's Louis, and everyone's been wondering what he's been up to and what he's been thinking. And a lot of it's really mean-spirited. I suggest you go and listen out of curiosity. Although that said, I really can't condone, even if it's a comedian I hate or love, I just really can't condone recording a comedian without their consent because you don't know what those jokes are at. Actually, on second thought, don't listen to them because what good is that for? I guess if you want to listen to it, don't listen to it as a fan. Listen to it as a scientist. I think that's the only way to do it. That's justifiable. But don't record comedians without their consent. Come on, man. Be respectful of the craft. They need a place to work out new jokes. I don't think I need a little soapbox to say this, but hey, maybe I do. I'd like to think if you're watching this video, you care enough about comedy to respect it in that sense, but maybe you don't. I don't know, but I'll lecture you if no one else will. Don't do that. Yeah? Okay. So eventually, not only is he doing drop-ins, but he starts to do actual shows. And then he starts to do a tour. And those tour spots aren't the spots that he's used to going to, If you look at the locations, it's a little curious. He goes to Poland and the Ukraine, and I guess goes to places where he's more welcome. I wonder how that affected his comedy. What do people from those countries find funny? How is that different from what Americans find funny? And does he get the feedback that he needs on these tours to write good jokes? Because who's showing up to these shows, right? It's already people that know that they like him and know that they don't care about the controversies. So you're getting a certain type of person who's gonna have certain jokes that they will and won't laugh at. It's not gonna be as scientific as it used to be. If you're the type of comedian that listens to laughters and pauses and uses that as a, laughter-o-meter on how good a joke is, then that's a bunch of data that you just don't have anymore. And that's very critical.
Do you know finish?
So this brings us to now. I guess this is where I'll put for the people to jump ahead to. But that brings us to now. In March, he filmed one of the spots on his tour. I believe it was March 7th and 8th. He was in DC and he filmed that. And about a month ago, he dropped it on his site for $8. I know a lot of people who rushed to listen to it. I know a lot of people who waited for one of their friends to illegally send them an MP4 because they didn't want to give Louis $8 for moral reasons, but they wanted to listen to it. As I said earlier, I respect Louis very much. I think a lot of his jokes are really brilliant. But I think a lot of his jokes are kind of not for me. But, c'est la vie. I resisted for a while, I just didn't really care, and then eventually I ended up watching it. The first time I watched it, I hated it. But in the time since, I have changed my mind about it a few times, and I've had some new perspectives on it that I want to share with y'all. Um, I think I've liked it more and more each time I've watched it. I don't know what that means. You can psychoanalyze me as much as you want. But sincerely, Louis C.K., his new special, Post Cancellation, and the only comedian to do a Post Cancellation special is Aziz. He's the only other one. And I made a video about Aziz's special. I didn't really have that much to say. I realized now watching it again, lol. But I was fascinated by the timeline, and I'm fascinated by how comedians write these specials, because what are you going to say? How are you going to are you going to try to win people back? Are you not going to try to win people back? Are you going to like plant your heels in? I think I find it more interesting from a psychological perspective and a nosy perspective than I do from a like comedy perspective, which is pretty telling, I guess. Am I being too telling in this video? Maybe I am. I think one of the reasons I hated it the first time around was I was noticing the things I was annoyed at. I think I did have a, confirmation bias against not liking it. But bigger than that was the whole time I was like, okay, when's he going to apologize? What's he going to say? Is he going to back out? Is he going to go for it? Is he going to be like Aziz and have this like whole heartfelt, vulnerable moment?
All right, you want to talk about it? Should we talk about it? Yeah, all right. I don't mind talking about it.
The whole time it was just like this Chekhov's gun that I kind of felt like never really went off.
Man, I was in a lot of trouble. Wait till they see those pictures of me in blackface. That's going to be... If you ever ask somebody, may I jerk off in front of you? And they say yes. Just say, are you sure? That's the first part.
And I think if you're not holding your breath for that moment, there's some really good stuff in there. There's also some really annoying stuff. He has this tendency to do this thing where he tells a perfectly fine, sort of innocuous joke, and then he tags it and enters into the equation these things that make it somehow like offensive or provocative.
I got off the plane and it took off and it hit the World Trade Center. So that was bad.
And it's like, are you just trying to be edgy but like having nothing to say? If Louis C.K.'s comedy, or like what he was saying before all of this happened, had like a thesis, it would have been that life is really hard and it's full of gross, weird, complicated things. But at the end of the day, people are still really impressive. I think he had a real strain of humanism running through him.
I mean, you live in a great, big, vast world that you've seen none percent of. And even the inside of your own mind is endless. It goes on forever inwardly. Do you understand? The fact that you're alive is amazing.
And I didn't see that here. I think his brain couldn't handle everything that was going on, because whose could, right? On the one side, you have all these people telling you that you're a disgusting, awful human being and you deserve to die and you're a monster, right?
I learned a lot. I learned how to eat alone in a restaurant with people giving me the finger from across the room.
And then on the other side, you have these people in your head saying, those women, you're fine, you're the best, I can't believe they did this to you, you're the victim here. Like, you have these really bad voices, both of them really problematic, that I think are kind of poisoning you a little bit. And the big question right now in my mind is, was the person who wrote that letter real? Was it him? And is the person who made this special real? And is it him? Because they do not seem like the same person. And maybe, like I said, his brain was just kind of poisoned by these toxic influences. Maybe one of the two is a front. I don't know. If you're watching, can you tell me? Because I really want to know. But it's that dissonance between the person who wrote that letter and the person who did that special that is really what's upsetting for me as a viewer. I don't like feeling like I'm being lied to, and it doesn't add up. Let's remind ourselves that, a line or two from that letter, right? Let me find it again. And I can hardly wrap my head around the scope of hurt I brought on them, right? And then I got into trouble.
Anybody else get in global amounts of trouble? Anybody else?
And compare that to what Aziz had to say.
I saw the world where I don't ever get to do this again. And it almost felt like I died.
So maybe you're asking, Katie, I don't care, is it funny, right? Totally valid. That's something you could ask me in like most videos I make. And I'm not here to tell you what is and isn't funny, because guess what? No one can do that for you but you. I think there's some really funny stuff in there. I think there's some really disappointing stuff in there. But the biggest issue comes down to that dissonance, right? And a big part of what worked about Louis' material in the before times, right, is that we trusted him. And that's a part of why it all feels so terrible, is that so much of his material is built on trust. If you have a premise that's something really terrible and offensive, for that joke to work, we have to trust you that you're gonna land that idea, right? You're gonna start us somewhere crazy, but if we trust you that you're gonna land this plane and that we're gonna be able to laugh and it's gonna be okay, we're gonna be able to listen to that joke. But if we don't trust you, we can't even get off the ground with that. It's not gonna fly. Like, if you want to talk about something perverted, but we think you're just a normal guy, that's very different than someone talking about something that's really perverted that has like admitted to sexual misconduct. That's a different situation. He's not the only one that's changed. We've changed too. I don't think there's ever going to be a comedian with the mass appeal that Louis had, possibly ever again. And that's because everything is so splintered right now, right? I don't think there'll ever be a comedian that appeals to all of the different categories that we have right now. Just, like TV numbers will never be what they were in the 80s and 90s. I just don't see it happening. Do you? I don't see a comedian winning over the people who like Mulaney and the people who like Joe Rogan and the people who like Bill Burr. I feel like those are all really different people looking for really different things from stand-up. And I don't know if I see it happening again. Do you want to know how big Louis was when he was big? Here's how you know how big Louis was. Now let's talk about it, right? Louis was so big that I remember in like 2012, 2013, Pete Holmes saying that his favorite comedian was Bill Burr, and I remember that being a big deal. Can you imagine that being a big deal right now? We're so far from like any unanimous decision on who the best comedian is. Oh my god, we're so far from it. Like, you could name a dozen comedians and pitch it in a way and convince me that they're the best. It's just like not possible. But back then, everyone agreed it was Louis. Everyone agreed. It just like, it was baffling how unanimous it was when I really think about it. And comedy is it's just different now. We're in a weird time right now, and we don't have anyone leading a charge like we did with Louis. We knew what comedy was, and we knew where stand-up was going and where it had come from back then, but I don't know if we do now. It's messy, y'all. It's hella messy. 2 years ago, after the cancellation, I made a video talking about what I wanted from stand-up. And I didn't get it. I didn't get it at all. I made a pitch that I thought that in a post-Trump, post-Me Too world, I didn't want catharsis comedy. I wanted distraction comedy, right? And there's kind of like a x-axis of that, right? Do you want someone talking about the thing and finally catharsis saying it and getting to talk about it? That's the like Lenny Bruce, Richard Pryor, George Carlin school of comedy. Or do you want the distraction school? Do you want someone to talk about silly things and make you forget about all of the crap going on over here, right? And that's, your Mitch Hedbergs and your Steve Martins and those types of people. So, and I'm sure there's a million y-axes that you can throw in there, but that's a good one. And I was really pushing for that one. I was like, can we get a Steve Martin up in here? Can we get someone to remind us to be silly, please? Please, please, please. And I even made like nominations of who I thought could lead the next charge and who I wanted to see influencing people in the way that Louis did. And I wanted to see open micers across the country. And I wanted to see, moms and dads who don't know anything about stand-up but like know them. I wanted to see them hobnobbing with, Stephen Colbert, that sort of thing, right? I wanted that level, and I don't think I got it. And here's, I think, what I got instead. Comedy didn't get silly. Comedy just got sadder. If you look at the stand-up specials that have been released in the past 2 years, they're sad. Don't get me wrong, there's some gems, there's some really funny stuff, and comedy can definitely come from a place of sadness, no question. That's like one of the greatest ways in which we can use comedy, but it's so sad. Katie from 10 to 2 years ago would be crazed if she heard me say this, but I think improv is at a cooler place right now than stand-up. Things like Middleditch and Schwartz playing at Carnegie Hall and on Netflix, like, that's, I think, more interesting and more compelling and more fun to watch. I can't believe I'm saying this. You know how much I love stand-up and how much it means to me, but damn, man. It's so sad right now. And I don't blame comedy or comedians for that, because the world is really sad right now. But I think an art form like improv that is more inclined to be escapist is more what I'm looking for, at least. I don't know if it's what y'all are looking for, but you're gonna be more likely to find me tuning into that than to stand up right now, which is wild. I said earlier in this video that it's going to be about nuance. And I think one of the reasons I was disappointed in the Louis special is because I know how smart he is, and I know how savvy he is, you know? And I was like, my bar was too high. I was like, maybe he'll be someone that could come back from this and that could maybe heal some people and could make people think about forgiveness in a way that we just haven't been thinking about it. It's not even a way we haven't been thinking about it at all. Just the concept of forgiveness doesn't seem to exist anymore. And so I was like, it would be cool if he could earn that, I guess. And I was disappointed that he didn't try. I was disappointed that he was just like, I got into trouble and consent is complicated. I was hoping it wasn't going to be that. It was just a bummer, though. If anyone could have done it, I really believed in him to be the one to do it. But yeah. Maybe he could have gotten us out of some of this sadness, but I think the sadness is here to stay because it's quarantine. But you know what? Maybe people will go crazy enough in quarantine that they start producing really fun, wackadoo, silly shit, you know? Like, Whitmer Thomas's Big Baby is a great example of something really silly to come out of quarantine, and I'm hoping for more of that. That's what I want. But it's always gonna be so alt. It's never gonna be big enough, I don't think. Okay, I'm rambling now. This was really, really fun. I didn't think it would be because I didn't want to really make this video because Louis C.K. is exhausting to talk about. But I'm hopeful. I'm proud of improv. I'm excited for what stand-up can do next. I hope you enjoyed my new background. I'm quarantining in a different place. But I'll be back soon with more stuff. And if you want a new comedy special to listen to, check out Dan Perlman's new album that just dropped. He's a friend and he's a really good sounding board. And a good person and a funny person. I was at the show, so maybe you can hear my laugh. But enjoy it. Go, support comedians on Patreon. Support each other. And don't do anything dumb in quarantine. Bye. How'd I do? Okay. Cole, should Louis be uncancelled? No, you don't think so? Nah. Let's stop. Yeah?